Is morality really just a bunch of commands? Let's consider. Hello, philosophers. I'm Chico. Welcome to the Philosopher's Show, where we consider the greatest questions of human history. Consider a moral statement. You should not forcibly harvest people's organs, or you ought not forcibly harvest people's organs. What does the word ought do there? One thing is, it seems like it's a command. It seems like it tells you, hey, you do not do this, right? Do not forcibly harvest people's organs. That is no. And if that's the case, maybe that's all there is to moral statements. So prescriptivism is a moral philosophy developed by R.M. Hare that says that moral judgments are purely prescriptive. They just are like commands telling you what to do and what not to do. So the statement, you should not forcibly harvest people's organs, really just means do not forcibly harvest people's organs. Now, being commands, these are neither true nor false. And what do I mean by that? Well, if I were to tell you, go mow the lawn, you might tell me no, but you wouldn't tell me false. When we use the word ought, then we're committing ourselves to something like a command. This means to use it logically, we have to follow a rule. We could call this the prescriptive rule. We must keep our moral beliefs in harmony with how we live and want others to live. Now, having said all that, you might sort of balk at prescriptivism here, thinking, doesn't that sound just as arbitrary as emotivism? Remember, emotivism, good or bad, was really just a way of just emoting, of just saying, yay, this thing, or boo, that thing. And, you know, your emotions are just so irrational. They're so just willy-nilly that you can't really depend on them for solid moral reasoning. Does this mean that we're left to such arbitrary wiles as our own desires, right? We're talking about commands here, and the commands are based on our desires, right? Like we said in the rule, what was it? How we want others to live. But ought does a second job. It commits us to a second rule we could call the universalizable rule. We must make similar evaluations about similar cases. In other words, whatever that we decide that we are going to do, the prescription that we are giving for ourselves in any given situation, we would have to put ourselves in a similar situation on the other side of the fence and say, would I want that done to me in that scenario? Now, Hare wants to maintain that these are logical rules. They're not rules that we deduce from facts of the matter, right? We don't look out at the world and discover these rules. It's just that this is what the word ought means. You know, in order to use the word ought correctly, that we're going to have to use these two rules. We're going to have to apply these two rules consistently. And so Hare claims that this makes them logical rules. Now, the universalizable and the prescriptive rule together entail a golden rule consistency condition. That is, that it is illogical to hold, I believe that I ought to do something to someone, and I don't desire this to be done to me in the same situation. Now, the fact that those two things are logically inconsistent sort of tempers our desires here. You know, it makes it so that our desires can't just run free, that our desires, so it's not like emotivism in that case. Instead, our desires are sort of kept in check by each other. And of course, this would require for us to be informed and imaginative. You know, we would have to know exactly what we're doing and what it would be like. We have to imagine ourselves being in the other person's shoes. So what does this reasoning look like? Let's say that you have a new person show up to work, and you look at that person, you say, wow, that person looks a little uncomfortable. You know what? I want to invite that person out to lunch. There's your prescriptive rule, right? I want to invite this person to lunch. Your universalizable rule is, if I were in that situation, I would want that done to me. Okay, so I would want that done to me. We have logical consistency. I can do that thing. If instead I saw this person and I said to myself, you know, I want to turn my back on that person and pretend like they're not here. And then the universalizable rule, that was the prescriptive rule, the universalizable rule, I wouldn't want that done to me. I wouldn't want somebody to turn their back on me when it was my first day and I was uncomfortable. Now, holding those two things, Hare says, is logically inconsistent. Therefore, that is a bad thing. And not morally bad, by the way, just logically inconsistent. So there is no such thing as morally good or bad here. There is just you're either logically consistent or you're logically inconsistent. And moral good and bad is just reduced to just those two things. Now, one good thing about this is that it allows you to form your own moral opinions. So everything is really based on your desires. It's, I want to invite this person out to dinner, and can I universalize that desire? Would I desire that in the same situation? Or I want to do this. Would I want the same thing in the same situation? No? Okay. So it's great. We get to form our own moral opinions, and yet it still gives us a method for reasoning morally. It gives us the golden rule, consistency, condition, and we can see, even though we're following our desires, that's going to show us how we can tell what we should or shouldn't do. Another argument for this view is that it passes the Hitler test. So as Hitler, you might have the prescriptive, I want to commit genocide on the Jewish people. And then when you follow the universalizable rule, you might look at it and say, but wait a second, I would not want genocide committed on me if I were Jewish. So it would be logically inconsistent for me to do. So, I want to avoid that. Now, there are some objections that you could give to this argument, and Hare goes through them. The first objection, you could think, in my universalizable, however, I would want genocide to be committed against me if I were in the Jewish population. And if that's the case, Hare just says, you're just crazy. Sorry. We can't really reason with crazy people. So I don't know what to do about that. Another thing you could do is just refuse to make moral judgments. So you're only logically inconsistent if you're using the word ought, right? If you're using the word should and not following the golden rule criterion. So then just don't use the word ought. Just throw it out and forget the moral reasoning. And if that's the case, he says, there's nothing we can do about that. If you don't play that game, then, we can't fault you one way or another. Or you could just reject the need to be consistent or rational. You could say, so I'm not rational, so what? And if that's the case, then he says, you've been refuted. You have proven that you have been refuted by our theory because, you have said that it is irrational. Your view is irrational. A final objection, this whole thing is predicated off of his logical analysis of the word ought. He says that the word ought just is those two rules, the prescriptive rule, the universalizable rule. Now, the prescriptive rule, okay, that one's hard to argue against, but the universalizable rule, maybe we could say that's not necessarily thrown in the mix, But what if we decide to just reject that part of the word ought and we just stick with the prescriptive? Would that work? And he says, but that would be a very unnatural use of the word ought, right? His use of the word ought is a lot more natural according to him. So that's the way that the word is used normally. So we should use it that way. I think this actually brings up another interesting objection though, which is this: when you look at these rules, they're not logical rules in themselves. The universalizable rule especially, let's look at that one. We must make similar decisions about similar cases. It's not illogical for you to make different decisions about about similar cases. That's not an illogical thing for you to do. The illogical part comes because he says that the word ought just means the prescriptive rule, the universalizable rule. So if you use the word ought and you don't use those two rules, then you're being illogical in that way. But is that really where we want the problem to be? It seems like we want the problem to be that if you violate the universalizable rule, that makes something immoral, or what he wants to say is logically inconsistent. But violating that rule by itself doesn't make something logically inconsistent. In fact, that looks more like a moral rule. You should make similar evaluations about similar cases. Of course, if that's the case, then things get a lot more complicated because now we have the word should defining universalizable and universalizable defining should, and that's a vicious circle. So if we were going to go that route, then things would have to change drastically. A second objection, this claims to be an evaluation of the meaning of the word ought, and yet then it fails the notorious that clause test. So what do I mean by that? on this view, saying something like, you should not rape means don't rape. And yet, if I were to say, I believe that you should not rape, does that mean the same thing as I believe that don't rape? No, because that doesn't even make sense, right? I believe that don't rape? What? That's not a proper locution. So it seems like this can't be a proper evaluation of the word ought or should. Or if you haven't figured out yet, ought and should mean the same thing in this video. So I apologize if that was confusing to you. A third objection is that, one of the selling points apparently to this view is that there are no truth values to moral claims. And yet, don't we want that? If I tell you, you should not rape children, wow, that's a big statement, right? But do you want that to be neither true nor false? Do you want that just to be a command? Just, hey, don't do it. It seems like if somebody does it, you want to say that was wrong, man. Something was morally deficient about what you did. That's an awful thing. And it seems like that's what we're claiming. We're not just commanding somebody not to do something. We're making a true evaluation about the situation. We're saying that it's evil. We might even be wrong about whether or not there is good or evil. That might be the case, but at least it seems like that's what we're claiming. A final objection for this view is that it seems like it leaves us with no motivation for moral reasoning. And what do I mean by that? Well, on this view, to be immoral is just to be logically inconsistent. Right, is just to reason logically and consistently. So if there's no such thing as good or bad, if it's just a bunch of commands that we're giving, then there is no such thing as it being good to be logically consistent or being bad to be logically inconsistent. So why would you want to be one over the other? Now, I know some people are going to say, well, I guess if you want to be that way. That's to retain a sense of moral superiority that on this view does not exist, right? This, I guess if you want to be that way, is sort of saying like, you're down there and I'm up here, for you being that way and me being the noble way that I am. Yeah, but again, if there's no such thing as morality, if it's just a bunch of commands, then there is no you're up here and I'm down there. We're all on the same plane. So whether it be, the genocide, even if you pass the Hitler test because you can say you shouldn't do it because you'd be logically inconsistent, really, you can't say you shouldn't do it because you'd be logically inconsistent. You really just say you would be logically inconsistent. But whether you should or shouldn't be logically inconsistent, now that's a different story. On this view, to say you shouldn't be logically inconsistent would just be to say it would be logically inconsistent to be logically inconsistent, which, okay. So although I do think this view gives us a lot of good tools for moral reasoning, I think it falls well short when it comes to actual morality. It doesn't give us what we need when we're going to make a moral philosophy. In any case, that's what I think, but again, I always say the best philosophy happens in dialogue, so please let me know what you think, and don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, and I will see you guys in the next video. Adios.